Hello, welcome to another episode of DGM Starter. Today I'm joined here with Tyler Leber, who is a co-founder of Venture Validator. And Venture Validator, I think it fits really well with what I'm trying to do here with this podcast, because I'm trying to give tips and tricks to help, especially early stage startups and entrepreneurs, really get going. And Venture Validator is a company where you can bring them an idea. Maybe you put some things together with a product or something, and then you can give it to them, and they'll validate it. They'll find your market. They'll give you tips on what you need to change in order and pricing and different things like that. I'm sure we'll get into more detail here, but I think it's a really cool company, a really cool service. So with that said, let's get into it. How are you doing today, Tyler?
Fantastic.
Good to hear. So I was introduced to Venture Validator. I think I saw someone, they shared something, whether it was a case study or I don't remember where it was, but I saw that on LinkedIn and that really caught my interest. So then from there, that's when I followed the company and reached out to you. And so I'm just curious, like, what's kind of the story behind how Venture Validator was started? How did that process go?
Yeah, for sure. Started a couple years ago, so I'd say we're technically still a startup ourselves. And the story of Venture Validator really starts with our founder, Eric Espinosa. So he's the founder of Venture Validator, and he's a serial entrepreneur. He tried out a ton of different startups in college, and had some really good ideas. He won competitions, he won prize money, and then he finally found one startup that worked, which became Venture Validator. But it actually came because he started so many startups. He realized that he was really good at deciding if this was a good idea or a bad idea. And he went through so many ideas that he started talking with other entrepreneurs and helping them validate their own ideas. And he realized he could make a business out of that, validating other ventures. So he started what was called Wow Factor Consulting, and it was more of like a one-on-one validation service, consulting service, and business was going really well. So he decided, how do I make this a scalable venture? And that's when he brought me on. So just, fairly early on, figuring out, how to scale it, how do we systematize everything at Wow Factor Consulting and make it Venture Validator, a scalable company. So I actually hopped on as a unpaid intern, but we immediately hit it off. We really enjoyed, how we worked together, and we started it off completely remote, which actually worked really well once COVID hit. Were very used to that work environment, so we actually use Marco Polo in our day-to-day team communication, and that's been fantastic for us. So anyway, I hopped on as an unpaid intern, but quickly moved to a paid position, and then just kind of grew into the role of co-founder, COO, and then now we have a few employees, and we're growing.
That's crazy. You jumped from unpaid intern to co-founder, and I don't know how long it took, but it must have not been long if you've been around for a couple of years.
Yeah, not long.
That's awesome. I think that's we chatted a little bit on LinkedIn while we were setting this up, but I really think this is a really cool service. I think it really fills a hole in the market because you mentioned to me earlier that learning how to validate is tough, and other options out there are really expensive, or they either want a large piece of your company. So I think this is a really cool option, especially as I feel like right now starting small businesses is starting to be more popular, and a lot more people are seeing that as a viable option as opposed to like a super risky option.
Right.
But with that being said, I think it's a cool story, and I kind of want to dig into kind of some tips that you have for startups as they're preparing for the validation process. And so if there's someone who has a business idea out there and they would like to either validate by themselves or come work with Venture Validator, what are those first steps that you think need to be done? Because obviously validation is early in the process, but what should they come to the table in order to have the data actually work and tell them what they need to know?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do a quick plug. We have a course actually for Venture Validator, and we basically teach all of our methodology. So that is definitely a resource to use. But I would say my biggest tip is to actually validate, because a lot of entrepreneurs, they know it's important. Like, any entrepreneur will say that validation is important, but not all of them do it, and a lot of them don't do it correctly. So, I mean, there's a huge variation to what that validation looks like for each entrepreneur. A lot of people will just ask family and friends, what they think of the company. And that, there's a ton of things wrong with that, because first off, your product, your new idea is your baby. So you automatically put some kind of bias into your questions. And then also, your family and friends, they like you, they know you. So they're automatically biased towards you. And that, in turn affects what they think of your company, of your business. So, I would say you need to find your actual target market, and that's hard because it's likely outside of your sphere of influence. And that's really why Venture Validator is so important, because we can service people that don't want to do that hard work. And if you do want to do that hard work, we also have this course that you can buy to do it yourself. But yeah, really just actually doing the hard work of validation, whether by yourself or having us do it for you, that is just so important, because 42% of startups fail because there is no market need, which is a huge percentage. And then out of those 42% of startups, you typically lose an average of $30,000 of personal investment, and then however much time you sunk into that venture. So validation is like a cheat code kind of thing. You can figure out if this company is going to succeed or fail really before you spend any big amount of money or time on building the product, because you can ask people way before your MVP, your minimum viable product, or anything like that, and actually figure out, is this going to work? Before you spend a bunch of time and money on it.
Yeah, that's super good point. And like, I don't know, I don't know if I have much else to add, but because I don't know, I've like recently, maybe a few months ago, and kind of to give you some background and why I'm interested in validation specifically in early stage entrepreneurs. But so what I do for work is I'm a digital marketer. I primarily run ads for smaller businesses. So I see a lot of businesses come in, they have a cool new idea, and they've done zero validation. Maybe the most I've seen is like a Kickstarter campaign, which it kind of validates your product. You get something out of it.
For sure.
And I've just seen so many cool ideas where we've spent 4 or 5 months trying to run ads, and that's really their validation process. Is just testing audiences that we think will work.
Right.
And so after a while of seeing that, I'm like, oh, there's too many businesses that just aren't making money, even though I think there's something out there for them. Right. And so that's kind of where I've discovered this. And I ran into Venture Validator a few months later, and that's how you're here. But yeah. So I've kind of been immersing myself in that. I think it's super interesting, but and I've been following along more with entrepreneurship stuff as well.
Nice.
But to kind of jump back into your growth, like you said, Venture Validator is more in the startup stage, and obviously you're helping a ton of startups. That's kind of your role. So I'm kind of curious, what have you been seeing as you've been trying to grow the company? What are maybe some road bumps that you've seen along the way, and kind of advice that you could share from your experience here to entrepreneurs trying to get their startup off the ground as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is like, we really just do have to take our own medicine. Like, it's not like we're perfect because we have this validation company. Like, we suffer from the same things that any entrepreneur, any founder suffers from. Like, we always assume, what our target market wants us to build, and we start building it, and then we catch ourselves thinking, okay, do our customers, do our clients actually want us to build this out? And we have to do our own tests, we have to do our own surveys to see what our target market wants, what price to set, what product features to build. So that's definitely been challenge is making sure that we're keeping ourselves accountable and following all these validation rules and steps. And I mean, we built the company and the processes for probably a solid year and a half before we really started scaling. And so challenging for us now is really just getting the word out there, because we spent so much time and effort getting all of these processes and, systematizing everything, where now we are, like you said, we're ready to take people's ideas in and then spit out this validation report, like a market research report. And that's likely what you saw on LinkedIn. And so we're just, this smooth machine now. So now we just need to get the word out there about Venture Validator. But yeah, I would say that was definitely one of our biggest struggles in that build phase, is we spent too much time building things that nobody really wanted. We'd figure out that nobody wanted it and, have to go back to the drawing board. So it's so much easier if we follow our own processes, do surveys, do interviews, and figure that out before we dump a ton of time and money into building things out.
That's actually really interesting, because that's a good point, that even if you've run businesses or about validation, you can still kind of fall into those easy traps of you want to make it perfect before you do anything else.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, so you kind of have a process, and I'm sure it's slightly different for each customer, but largely the same. But I'm kind of curious, and I'm sure you have that course, so that will go in more depth of what you take if anyone wants to hear more about this. But what's kind of your general process that you come in? How do you decide how to validate a what medium do you use? Do you talk to actual people? Do you create a survey, and how do you distribute that survey?
Yeah, that's a great question. For us, our focus is on online surveys. And I think it's an extremely effective way to do it. I would recommend it, because it usually will take people out of their sphere of influence. So they can use a third-party panel provider, which is nice. Now I want to give a caveat to that, because third-party panel providers, there's a lot of survey scammers and gamers on there. So we found that 85 to 90% of data you get from SurveyMonkey, Cint, there's a few other sites, 85 to 90% of that data is crap. You can't use it to validate your business, because those people are just rushing through the survey. And there's a lot of tips and tricks you can use to find those people and take them out. So it can be expensive to do that on your own, because you typically have to pay for all of those crap responses, but you can't actually use them. So like I said, we typically do surveys with 25 to 200 people, but you can definitely do one-on-one interviews with people. And we have a free template if anybody wants that, for how to go through those interviews. But like I said, on the survey, on the interview, you just need to make sure that you're not biasing your questions and leading people on, and really not trying to sell your product or business. It's actually helpful to think of it as your friend's company. Okay, yes, this is your idea, but for this purpose, think of it, okay, my friend is wanting to validate this business, and then try to go to describe the product as succinctly as you can, and pretend like this is your friend's company, so you have no emotional connection to it, and you are just trying to validate it for him and get honest, blunt feedback.
I really I've not heard that about writing a survey and trying to think it because that's a good point, especially when it's your idea, it's your baby.
Right.
There's going to be a lot of emotion thrown into there.
Yeah.
So that's a good, and that's almost another point of why you should reach out to another company to do that, especially if you're kind of iffy on the whole validation process yourself.
Yeah, and that even goes into the analysis of the results. It's hard because it is your baby, and so you want it to hit a certain score or a certain metric, and you might filter out the data to just barely hit that score. You might filter people out based on the results you want. So again, that's another reason you want somebody that's independent, third party, unbiased to go through the data, because they'll give you more of the cold hard facts. and without any of that emotional connection.
And yeah, that makes sense, especially with something like a survey where it's so like maybe the answers aren't open-ended. You probably some of them are like yes, no kind of stuff. But with the question, you're writing it open-end. And if you don't have experience with that, there's so many biases you can throw in there. You can mislead them, and the data may be in your favor. But then when you go to invest, no one's actually buying. And I think that's like, that process is probably the toughest part, is actually either conducting those interviews or writing those surveys out, because that's where all the room for error is.
Right, definitely.
That's super interesting though. Like you said, like try to take that emotion out of it. I'm curious though, like so we've talked the story about Venture Validator, some tips that you have there. What, like, before you joined Venture Validator as the unpaid intern, did you have any interest in starting your own business and working for startups? Like, did you just kind of fall into this world, or was this something that you were interested in for however long before?
Yeah, I love this question because I would say I'm definitely in the entrepreneurship world now, and I have always been interested in it. I've always been interested in being an entrepreneur. Like, that's always been appealing to me, but I've never felt like I could be, because I don't feel like I always have these great business ideas. And I'm not confident in them enough to like execute them. So I never thought there was like a place for me in the entrepreneurship world. But meeting up with Eric and starting Venture Validator has been fantastic, because I've been able to realize that Eric, he is like the visionary. He is the one that has all the great ideas. He had the idea for Venture Validator, and he has tons of ideas, after Venture Validator does really well. And so he is this visionary, and I am more of the integrator, where I am like implementing the ideas that Eric has. So like, I am totally happy in this role. Like, I am still an entrepreneur. Like, anybody would probably call me an entrepreneur. But for me, the definition was always like idea man equals entrepreneur, where now I realize like, I don't have to be the idea man. I can just help the idea man, put his dreams onto paper and into processes and actually execute on them. So, I think it was just a total stroke of luck that I met up with Eric, because I was actually going to start at Vanguard, which is just a financial advising firm. And so I had, that decision to go with Vanguard, the super safe, stable thing, and then Venture Validator, which was, fairly unproven at the time. And I love entrepreneurship. And I had found Eric and just had this good relationship with him. So, it's an easy decision for me to go with Venture Validator, now that I realized I didn't have to be this idea man all the time.
That's actually really interesting, because I don't know if you've read the book Start With Why by Simon Sinek. Okay, it's one of my I've kind of recently gotten into reading, so I feel like the number of books I've read is kind of low, but it's one of my favorite books that I've read in the past year or so.
Nice.
And he talks about a concept where he's like, there's why people and there's how people. And he said how people can start businesses, but they're typically not huge and like game changing.
Right.
When why people start businesses, they're huge and game changing, but they always need a how person to help them do that. So when you explained that story, that's exactly what I was thinking of. Okay, I'm like, okay, we got your why and your how guy, so Venture Validator is going somewhere.
Yeah, no, I totally believe in that concept. I mean, that's helped us so many times, because sometimes the how person needs to rein in the why person a little bit, but then also the why person needs to expand the vision of the how person sometimes.
It's a good partnership, because the how person like wants to make stuff happen. He goes and makes it happen, and the why person is always there, like taking it a step beyond like no one has thought about before.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's I think that's like when I was writing down questions before this podcast, like normally I have a tough time like trying to figure out exactly what I want to ask. And I sent you over a list. It wasn't terribly long, but I really liked each of the questions. And so
Yeah.
I'm kind of towards the end of the list, and this is one that I typically reserve for dead last in the podcast, and maybe that's how it'll end up. But I'm curious. Like you said, you weren't there from the beginning, but you've been here for the growth part, and there's lots of growth in the future that I'm sure if someone were to ask you the same question a couple of years down the road, it may be different. But for anyone who either they have an idea or they want to start a business even though they don't have an idea yet, what would like be your main piece of advice? Either, and it doesn't have to be like about the validation process, but like what can they do to shore up themselves to increase their chance of success in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, like the best answer I have is going back to the validation process, honestly, because I mean, I have had my share of ideas, and Eric had his share of ideas. And so if you do have an idea, I'd say validation is like the best thing you can do, because you quickly figure out if it's going to be successful or not. And so you could spend the next 2 years like dreaming of how this product is going to change the world, or you could spend 2 months validating it and then realize, oh, this is going to change the world, or no, I need to find a better idea. And so like that is just such a beautiful concept to me. Like I am, Venture Validator is helping these startups save so much time and money and emotional effort and stress in the long run by just doing a little bit of validation in the short run. So honestly, I have to bring it back to the validation process. But for people that don't have an idea, or you don't have anything to validate, for me that's like exactly where I was a few years ago. I had no good ideas, but I knew I wanted to be in the entrepreneurship world, and so I just kind of put my head down and developed myself and developed my skills, so that when an idea did come along, I was 100% ready to go. And like that's how it worked out. Eric posted this job in Handshake for director of operations, and I was like, I don't know if I'm good at operations, but I have these skills, and like I think I could do pretty well at this. And like if I had just spent my time worrying about trying to come up with a new idea, or I wasn't going to come up with one, then I wouldn't have been ready for that opportunity. But instead, I had all these hard skills that I could bring to the table, and then just hit the ground running when this idea man or the why person came along. So it really just depends where you're at in the entrepreneurship journey. But yeah, if you have an idea, for sure, you just have to validate it, if you want to save all of your time and money.
and kind of this is a different direction of a similar question though, but
Yeah.
for these people who either want to learn, I'll ask you two questions, which I know is bad, but
Okay.
they shouldn't be too hard to answer both. For people who want to learn more about validation, you mentioned your course, and so I'm curious, what resources would you recommend, maybe besides your course, to learn about that? And also kind of to go along with that entrepreneurship, are there any resources that you would really recommend for people trying to develop themselves as they're looking to become an entrepreneur?
Yeah, for validation resources, I mean, we have a paid course, but we also have a free course, which has a lot of great resources. And there's tons of stuff online. There's articles about product market fit and like what that actually means to have product market fit. And there's just tons of resources online for entrepreneurs. This podcast, DGM Starter, like that's a great resource for somebody that wants to validate their startup, because they hear from all these different experienced people. So yeah, I mean, just getting all the knowledge you can is great. And there's tons out there, and there's tons of free stuff. And then for people, maybe wanting to go into entrepreneurship, I would start with books. Like there's just so many fantastic books about what the entrepreneurship life is like. And then, I feel like it helps you figure out where you belong in the entrepreneurship world. Like Rocket Fuel, I think that's a fantastic book to start with, because that, and again, the book that you mentioned, that describes the why and the how people, I feel like those are probably two great books to figure out, who are you? Are you a why person? Are you a how person? Are you a visionary? Are you an integrator? And, there's a lot of different terms, like there's the hustler, the hipster, and the hacker. Like there's, three other different profiles that you could associate with. So there's so many ways that you can figure out who you are, where you feel like you belong, and then just really focusing on improving yourself in that role. And then, just going off to the races kind of thing, working on yourself in that role.
I love it. I love that. That's actually kind of some context behind that question. I feel like that's my favorite selfish question that I ask every time I have someone on here,
Yeah.
because it always gives me new resources to learn more. And so
Yeah,
I love that. Yeah, thanks for giving those recommendations on how we can learn and become better. And thanks for joining me today. I think it was a lot of fun. I learned. I love also hearing the story behind how companies start, and it's always fun to catch a company right as it's about to grow, because then you can follow its journey almost the whole way.
right.
But thanks for joining me today, Tyler. For everyone who is watching this or listening to this in audio form, check the description. I'll include the link to Venture Validator's website and some of the resources that we talked about here. And yeah, thank you. If you have any questions, reach out to me. My contact info is down there, or find Tyler on LinkedIn. I'll include his LinkedIn profile there. Thanks for joining us.